So I've started up Unity 5.1 and this is the welcome screen. I'm going to go ahead and create a new project. I'll call this terrain and I'll add my name to it. Location is very important. A Unity project isn't a single file like a lot of the programs we've used. A Unity project is a folder that's got tons of different files in it. So it's really important that wherever you place it, you can get to it later on. So right now it's set to be in my documents folder, and that's just fine for now. Make sure you're choosing 3D and then click on Asset Packages. For this, we're going to need the cameras. Actually, we won't need the cameras. We'll need the characters. We'll go ahead and add effects. And we'll go ahead and do the environment. And we're going to press Done. And then we'll press Create Project. And this will probably take a few minutes depending on how many asset packages we've actually imported. Now that my scene's loaded, this is the main Unity window. There's got a lot of things going on here, but once we get into it, you'll see it makes pretty good sense. Everything that's actually in our scene will show up here in the hierarchy. Right now we only have two things, the main camera and the directional light, and we can actually see those in our scene window. The directional light is shown with the sun because that's pretty much what it acts like for us. It's the sun. And the main camera that would show us if we actually went into the game. We enter the game by pressing play, and you'll see right now there's nothing here. Down here, we have our actual assets. These are things that we're going to add into our scene, and only things that we see over here in the project window are able to be added into our scene, and once we do, they would show up in the hierarchy. Over here on the right hand side we have the inspector, so that when we actually choose something like the main camera or the directional light, everything has different kinds of properties, and they'll always show up over here. One of the first things we need to do is actually import another set of assets that will make making our terrain a lot easier. There are a couple of ways that we can do this. First way is to go into Window and access the Unity Asset Store. The Asset Store acts a lot like an app store would for other devices, where developers have created a lot of great content that they sell on the store. There are also a lot of great things for free on the store. Right away, the one thing I was looking for right here is terrain assets. You could always search for it up here, but typically you can always find it down here in the top free. It's always number 1 or number 2. So in order to download it from here and import it into your project, you have to have a Unity account. If you're actually sitting in my classroom right now, you probably don't have a Unity account. So the other way to do this is I provided the assets in a folder here, the same folder where our videos are stored, and you can just take this folder and drag it into our assets pane, just like this. Inside the terrain assets are all kinds of good things that we're going to be using, and it makes pretty good sense: bushes, grass, rocks, textures, and trees. The first thing we're going to add into our scene to go along with the camera and the directional light is the terrain itself. And to do that, we're going to actually go up to Game Object, choose 3D Object, and one of our options is Terrain. And we start off with this flat piece of terrain. And what I'm doing right now is I'm rolling my mouse wheel, and that's going to zoom me in and out. If I hold my right mouse button down and move the mouse around, I can orbit around the camera. If I hold the mouse wheel in and move the mouse, I'm panning around. And I use my left mouse button to select things. So I'm going to select the terrain over here in the hierarchy. And notice it did pop up in the hierarchy, so now it's one of the 3 things in our scene now. And these are the main properties that we have for terrain. The first thing we're going to do is actually go to the far right, to the gear that stands for settings. And we don't need to change many of these things, but we are going to change the terrain width and length for now. It's important that if we want to do this, we do it now. So I'm going to go ahead and make this, I always do that by accident, 1000 and 1000. 600 should probably be good enough for the height, so you might want to go ahead and change it to about 600 if that works for you. Now, we have several other tools here in the terrain properties menu, and they make pretty good sense if you look at the icons. If we hover over, we get raise and lower terrain, so that raises and lowers the terrain. This one is called paint height. If we want a specific height for our terrain, this is where we're going to come, and we're actually going to start here in just a second. This is called smooth height. So if we want to take two different heights, say like a hill next to a non-hill or sort of a valley, we can smooth out the difference between them using this tool. We have the paint texture where we're actually going to add textures like rock and sand and grass onto our scene. The next one will allow us to place trees. The next one will be called paint details, which if you look at the little picture, it's for actual blades of grass and rocks and things of that nature. The next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and save my scene. So this is one scene. You could think of it like one level. And it's definitely possible for us to have multiple scenes. You can imagine having different levels in a world, or we have sort of an ice area and a lava area, or if you were to click on a house door and you wanted to go inside the house, it might be a separate scene. For our purposes, we'll probably only have one scene. So let's go ahead and save it. We'll do save scene as, and it's going to save the scene inside of our own assets folder inside of our own project. So I'm going to go ahead and call this main scene and save it. And from here on out, you can see I can do the shortcut Control S to save this scene, which you should do often. Next, let's click on our terrain button to open up our terrain menu. And as I stated, we're going to start with the paint height, and there's a reason for that. Right now, I could go ahead and click on raise and lower terrain, and this works much like you might expect it to work. It actually raises the terrain. But you'll notice the way that you raise terrain with this tool is to left click on it with a brush. You can adjust brush size and opacity. A higher opacity causes stronger shapes as opposed to a lower opacity. And if I want to lower the terrain, I hold down the Shift key and use the same left mouse button. But the problem at this point is if I try to lower it over here where I haven't raised it, right now I'm holding down the Shift key and left clicking and nothing's happening. That's because right now my terrain is at the lowest possible point. We made the terrain 600 high, but right now this terrain is sitting at 0. So what we're going to do is first off, I'm going to go ahead and put all this back down where it was. So I just made the brush really high, put the opacity all the way up, and held down Shift while I rolled over it. We're going to go into the Paint Height menu, and we're going to change the height in this right here to about 200. And we're going to press the Flatten button. What that's going to do is it's going to take this terrain and it's going to raise it up to the 200 level. What might happen if you do that is the terrain might pop off your screen, and that's no problem. If you click on the terrain over here, come back into the window and press the F key, you'll zoom in on it. That's a great shortcut to remember. If you click something in the hierarchy, come to the menu, I'm sorry, the window, and press F, you will zoom in on whatever that thing is. So here's our terrain. It's just been raised to the 200 mark. So now if I come back to my raise and lower terrain button, I can both raise the terrain and I can lower it. So now I can do things like mountains and hills, but I can also do things like lakes and rivers and caves and things of that nature. So I'm actually going to go back to my paint height. It's still at 200. I'm going to press flatten again, and that will get me back to a flat shape. Since we're actually going to be creating an island, what's going to be the easiest way to do this is for us to make the surrounding water basically the flat part, and we're going to raise the land out of it that will actually become the island itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by changing this to about 205. And I'm not going to press flatten this time. That would take the entire terrain up to 205. What I'm going to do is take my brush and I'm going to get the rough outline of my island using this brush that's at 205. And you see what it's done here. It's raised it. It's kind of hard to see, but it's raised it 5 above the water. It's not 5 meters or 5 yards. I don't even know what the measurement's supposed to be. There really isn't one, but it's raised it out of the water, so to speak. So I am painting my island now, and it's just barely outside the water. And what I'm going to do next is raise this to about 215. I'm going to bring my brush size down. And what I'm going to do is come on the inside of this island and gradually raise it up above the 205 level. So what I'm going for here is that we had a 205 region and now we have a 215 region. So basically we're gradually rising up out of the water, and it's not just a sheer cliff face all around the island. And as I do this, I could also employ our other tool next to it, the smooth height, which will do what it sounds like and smooth out the transition here so that it's not quite so sharp. Same thing, we have brush size and opacity. If I want it to be a little bit less smooth, I can turn down the opacity. So take a few minutes and gradually raise your island out of the water. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because what I'm going to show you next is going to make it a little bit easier for you to sculpt your actual island. We're going to go to the texture button to paint texture. And we're going to come over here to our terrain assets. And we're going to open up our textures by clicking right here. This little slider down here determines how large these actually are, your little previews. So what I'm going to do is click on Edit Texture. I'm going to add a texture. And this little window will pop up. The first texture you add, the way it works is the entire terrain will become that texture. It'll become the default texture, so to speak. So given what we're doing now, I think the one that makes the most sense for us would probably be sand. And we have several different kinds of sand here. I'm going to go ahead and choose this one. Feel free to choose your own. I'm going to press Add. And there we go. The entire terrain turned to sand. But it is definitely easier to see. So now I can go back with my paint height and I can continue to work. I've gone about and basically created the overall shape of the island. I'm not super worried right now about having it perfect. I just want the overall island itself. And I'm going to skip ahead again to give you some perspective on sort of the size that we're dealing with. You might look down and say, it's not very big. So we're going to actually put a first-person controller on the island for us to get some perspective on the size of what we have here. So what I've done, before we were down in the terrain assets, we had the textures open. If you close those and you go up to the standard assets, there's a folder called characters. And there's one called first person character. And then here we have a folder called prefabs. A prefab is an object that's been created for us already. It's got several moving pieces to it, but it's been done for us. It's prefabricated. We don't have to build it ourselves. Now, here's the first person controller that I want. And basically, all I have to do is click and drag it onto my scene. And there it is. Now, I'm going to remember that if I press F in the window here, I can come down and see it. And the problem is that right now it's sort of half sunken in the ground. And you can see that this first-person controller is made up of several things. It's got a camera. It's got an audio listener. It's got this capsule that's sort of half submerged in the ground. So we need to raise it up. And to do that, I have my tool right here, my Move tool selected, and I get my handles. And the green handle will raise this. And I'm just making sure that it's up out of the ground. And the beauty of the first-person controller is that now I can press the play button to enter my scene. And the mouse will automatically respond by looking the way I want to look. And the WASD keys will move me. And you see, even the running script has already been programmed in. So I have this sort of head bobbing up and down. Someone already programmed that for us, which is great. So now we get some perspective on how large our terrain actually is. It's definitely not as small as I thought it might be. So now I'm going to really start painting or sculpting the land itself using, I'm going to click on the terrain here, the actual raise and lower terrain button. And you'll see that you can raise up mountains or hills or whatever you want to call them. And if I wanted to, I could drop in the scene by pressing the play button, and I can sort of get perspective on the size of the thing that I'm creating. It's really important that when you make changes to the world, you're not inside of play mode. So when this play button is pressed and I'm inside the world, I'm in play mode. It's really important that you don't come and add things to the scene or change settings while this is going on. Those changes won't be saved. So I need to unclick the play button to come back into editing mode, and now my changes will be saved. So the raise and lower terrain button operates, as I said before, by left clicking to raise and shift clicking to lower. It would be really boring if you stuck only to these sort of easy round brushes. If we want to make realistic looking terrain, we need to get down and dirty with these gritty brushes that will add some actual texture to what we're creating, so that things begin to look real and spiky. And it's going to involve changing brush size and opacity quite a bit. And then I might switch over to my smoothing because it's actually a little bit too much. It's a little bit too spiky. So I'm going to go through in a second and I'm going to add some hills and some mountains maybe, and maybe even a lake. The lake will be easy. It'll just be a matter of holding down shift. I'm going to need to turn the opacity up a bit for that. A bit more, I guess. Oh, look at me, like a dummy. I still have my smooth tool changed, and I was wondering why I wasn't making any changes to the actual terrain itself. I need to go back to the raise and lower terrain button. So if I grab something like this, I want to make a lake, I could lower it in there. Or if I wanted to, say, make a river. Those are obviously way too much, but you get the idea. Unity has a Control-Z shortcut like most programs to undo, and it saves several undos, so you can do that. So I'm going to pause my video, and I'm going to come back in a minute after I've sculpted my terrain. I've got a pretty good rough draft here of what my island's going to end up looking like. You'll see, for the most part, I don't really leave any part of the island untouched, and let me show you why. If I press the play button to enter game mode, you see a lot of this it's kind of bumpy, which I think is great, because if you come over here to the right where I haven't changed anything, I've left it sort of perfectly smooth. A little bit longer of a trip than I expected. This is the part of the island where I sort of haven't touched it at all, and I find the 100% super flat to be 100% unrealistic. So I tend to add sort of bumps and grooves everywhere. I might have gone a little overboard here, which is no problem because I can definitely take my smooth tool and smooth it out. But for me, this sort of 100% smooth sort of destroys the illusion. It looks like it was made in a video game, or much more so than it does otherwise. So I've used a combination of many different brushes, and it's kind of surprising sometimes what the brushes actually do. This brush, for example, kind of looks silly, but then you start using it and it actually creates a pretty cool effect. Even things like the star, you might think that, I'm on the smooth again. If you move it around a bit, it ends up not looking like a star anymore. The one I was just talking about a second ago also adds fairly nice effects. And you think, oh, everyone will know exactly that I use the star brush, but definitely not when you start adding it together and turning down the opacity. And like I said, there's no need to overdo it with the bump, so I'm going to smooth this out quite a bit. Let's go ahead and add some water into our island to make it an island. And up until now, we've been sort of using the assets over here to find what we need, and we could definitely do that. We could also search for things. So if I come to this little search bar and type in water, you see that many things have the name water. I even have several folders called that. But if I go into this folder right here, and this one right here, the water, like the first-person controller, is a prefab. It's been pre-made for us. So the rippling of the water, the reflection of the water, the color of the water, that has all been pre-done for us, which is wonderful. It saves us a lot of work. So I open that, and I'm going to go ahead and do Water Pro Daytime. And I'm going to drag it onto the scene. And right now it kind of looks like nothing, which is fine. What I'm going to do is come over here. Up until now I've been using the move tool. Now I'm going to change it to the scale tool. And I'm just going to basically pull the X and the Y until this thing is at least the size of my terrain. All right, now it's the size of my terrain, which is fine, but most of my island is underwater, which is, less than ideal. So I'm going to go ahead and click back on the move tool, and I'm going to grab the Z handle here, and I'm just going to lower it until the parts of my island that are land and the parts that are water are the way I want them. Okay, that looks pretty good to me. I'm going to go ahead and find my first person controller by clicking it over here. I can press the F button to zoom in, and I'm pretty close to the water itself, so I'm going to go ahead and press play, and we can take a look. So there it is. Not bad. If I would prefer, and I think I might actually, I'm going to come over here to the Water Pro Daytime, and I'm going to press delete and get rid of it. I actually like the one a little bit better called Water 4 Prefabs, and let's do Water 4 Advanced, and let's bring it on here. Aha, you can already tell that it looks much nicer. I think it does anyways. So I'm going to get this thing in the middle if I can, around the middle. Get the scale buttons again, and I'm going to go ahead and it's even easier because this one's actually rectangular. So there we go. I'm going to lower it a bit because it's a little bit too much right now. Although that's kind of a neat sort of archipelago, Hawaiian island kind of thing going. And let's just pop back in. And yeah, I like that much better. I really like what's going on there. It's just a little bit more interesting to me. At this point, it's probably time to start painting some more textures on here because I'm getting tired of looking at this all sand island. So let's go back to the terrain here in the hierarchy and back to our texture tab here, and let's add some more textures. You'll recall that if we go to terrain assets and we go to textures, we have several to choose from. So let's go ahead and add a few. I'm going to add texture, and I can just grab them, put them here, and press add. And varying textures and using several will go a long way to making your island look a lot more realistic. And now it's as simple as choosing the texture you want. Don't forget to switch off of sand. Taking your brush size, opacity, and target strength. Getting the difference between opacity and target strength requires a little bit of practice and a little bit of trial and error. Target strength is sort of the transparency. So if I knock that down and I start painting, I'm going to see a little bit of what I just painted, but it's going to be mostly transparent, and mostly I'm going to see the sand coming through it. The opacity, if I turn it way up, it's sort of how much comes down at once. And it's sort of a fine concept to figure out. So just play with them to figure out what works the best. So it's pretty easy to paint the textures you want. I think sort of the artistry here is varying the textures a little bit. So not just using the same rocky texture for all of your rocks and mountains, throwing in pieces, especially maybe using one of these brushes that doesn't put it all together, especially on the grass areas where they'll be walking for the most part. So if I intermix this texture along with the one that I already put down, you end up with a much richer, much more realistic looking scene. Okay, it's also really important that you zoom around using the right mouse button and get all the sides of everything. The other part that requires a little bit of practice and a little bit of artistry is a sort of blend from one to the other. So when does the grass become mountain? There's probably not one hard and fast line where all of a sudden rock ends and there's grass. You sort of want to take a little bit of, and you can turn down the target strength at this point and add a little bit here, so it just sort of happens gradually as it would in nature. So I'm going to go ahead and pause, and I'm going to paint most of my island, and you should do the same. All right, I went pretty quick because I was really focused on getting this video produced, but I've gone through and I've added a lot of textures to the island. I've worked pretty hard to make sure that things blend, that you have sort of pieces of green amidst the rock, because I think that's realistic. That the sand sort of gradually turns into the grass. That there's more than one color of grass, and that they sort of just come and go, sometimes really randomly. Those are the things I was working on to make this look the best it could. I also felt like I wanted this to become sort of like a death mountain out here in the bay, so I made that much bigger and more foreboding. So that looks pretty good to me right now.